Hi, everyone. McKenna from Murder by the Book here. Happy to be joined by everyone for another virtual event. Tonight, we will be joined by Marie Benedict, the author of The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. But since I know it takes a couple minutes for people to kind of join us, we're going to do something a little bit different tonight. I'm actually going to talk about a couple of our events that are coming up this week, kind of warm up the virtual room, and then I will call her in very shortly. So if you have watched a lot of our virtual events, you'll see we're doing a lot of them. Tomorrow night, we'll be here with Ace Atkins. He's doing another, launches tomorrow, a new Spencer novel in the Robert B. Parker Spencer series. Wednesday, we'll have Nick Petrie for a new Peter Ash book, and he'll be joined by Don Bentley, interviewing him, the author of the Matt Drake books. Thursday night, we'll be here with Jason Penter for a new Rachel Marin book, and Friday will be PJ Tracy for a brand new series, first in series. She is the author of the Monkey Wrench series, which I'm a personal fan of, but this new series is great. I also want to mention that we have 3 subscription boxes that we have launched recently. The Cozy Corner subscription was just shipped out last week, and people who have pickups, those books should be on the way to you, or you've been notified for pickup. So if you're interested in finding out about our others, Best of the Month will go out next week. And we have a Crime Fiction Legends box also. You can find more information at Murder by the Box for those. And then another book that's out tomorrow that we absolutely adore, especially if you're a fan of historical fiction, is called House on Vesper Sands. And it is perfect if you like a great Wilkie Collins Victorian mystery. So anyway, it looks like we've got quite the crowd watching now. Thanks for your patience. I'm going to go ahead and add in Marie Benedict. Hi, Marie.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. You know, the pandemic has made us all so, isolated and separated. And for us to be able to connect this way virtually to readers and booksellers and librarians, it's really been a gift. And I'm thankful for indie bookstores for connecting us all through this crazy time.
Yes, well, we are thankful for authors for pivoting and being able to do this, and us all learning technology on a night-by-night basis. As we've already experienced, we've had a couple little glitches tonight, so bear with us if we have any disconnections. Keep watching. We will remedy them, and we will be back on. So without further ado, let me get you formally introduced, and then we'll start chatting. Marie Benedict is the author of The Other Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, The Only Woman in the Room, and
I'm sorry, McKenna, I can't hear you. So if you're asking me a question, I can't hear it. I apologize.
Okay, I am introducing you.
I'm going to sign back out and sign back in, and then hopefully we'll be able to pick right back up. Okay?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So like I said, we've had a couple technical issues already. I'm going to actually pop on Facebook and see what it is looking like on my end. Bear with us 1 second, because everything looks fine to me, but it could be on my end. Okay.
I'm back.
You're back. This is bizarre. I'm actually going to text a staff member and see if he can tell me how it looks on Facebook, and we'll see what's happening. So
we'll just do the best we can. How does that sound?
We will. 1 second. I will have an answer there. So what I was saying is that I was introducing you. So I'm going to introduce you. Can you still hear me?
I absolutely can.
Okay, perfect. We do have a couple comments that say you're fine, it looks fine, and loved your previous books. So maybe if you drop again, just you go away and come back. We'll keep doing this as many times as we need to.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that note. I appreciate it.
Yes, excellent. Thanks, Anita. All right, so Marie Benedict is the author of The Other Einstein, Carnegie's Maid, The Only Woman in the Room, and Lady Clementine. She's a lawyer with more than 10 years experience as a litigator at 2 of the country's premier law firms and for Fortune 500 companies. She's with us tonight to discuss her latest novel, and one that is of particular interest to me, The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. How are you?
I am doing so great. It feels a little bit crazy to be launching a book and having such wonderful reception for this book when the world is kind of crazy around us. But we're looking for silver linings these days, so we're hanging in there in these crazy, challenging times. And I'm just so excited to get to talk to people about this really incredible real life story. Even though I write fiction, it's very much anchored in the historical research and real life events. And this is absolutely no exception.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And actually, I have a little note to myself here that I want to talk about the book, but it's kind of a weird thing because it's hard to talk about without spoilers. That being said, it's a true story that's been around forever. So I won't give away the ending, but we might discuss a little bit. And if you say, I don't want to talk about that, we'll just tell me, okay?
Perfect. Now, it is a little tricky because there's a little bit of a spoiler in the actual real life piece of it. And then there's many layers of kind of mysteries that I hope I've embedded in the book itself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I was familiar with the story and I was intrigued to see, in real life, people still don't know 100% what happened. There are some facts and then there's things that aren't explained. Exactly. And so I was interested to see where you went with things. But if you have questions or if you're watching and you have comments or questions, if you're watching YouTube, you can put them in the live chat. They'll come onto my screen and I'll get to them in a little bit. Or on Facebook, you can just put them in the comments and we'll get to them later on. So clearly you like writing fiction about real life stuff.
Yeah.
Why Agatha?
Gosh, I think I have how much time do you have? I mean, I'm a huge Agatha Christie fan. It kind of all started with with the mission that I'm on with my books. You mentioned some of my other historical fiction Marie Benedict books. And, I'm really on a mission to kind of almost like an archaeologist, kind of digging out from the past, these real life historical women who've made such significant contributions to our societies, have such really vast and important legacies, but for the most part, we don't know them. A lot of them we've never heard of, or we don't really understand the nature of their contributions. And they're also women who've dealt with really interesting, timely, or topical issues, right? So once for a long time, I kind of circled back to my original passion, which was history and kind of bringing out women's voices and women's stories. I feel like I developed, for lack of a better word, almost like an antenna for the stories, right? And I see these women, hear their stories everywhere. And so because of that, I kind of keep this crazy running list of women. It's huge. And whether I hear a little something that someone tells me, it could be a reader telling me a little vignette, or I read a little bit of a newspaper article, or there might be one of those blue plaques on the side of a wall that mentions a historic woman from a historic building. I kind of gather all of them together. And then as I'm writing other books, I kind of dip into the research of those women and kind of see what their stories hold, what their voices can tell us. Now, in the case of Agatha Christie, it's a little different because I've always loved Agatha Christie. Since I was probably in middle school, I've been reading her books, and I've always kind of been fascinated with her work and her mysteries and the way she shaped them. And, unlike a lot of women, her legacy is really hugely known. I mean, the name Agatha Christie conjures up a whole world. So it was really when I kind of dipped into the research about her life to kind of see how she came to be this magnificent writer, creator of a huge legacy. And I started to learn more about her life. And then I came into contact with the disappearance. That's kind of how I really fastened on to that story, because it was so intriguing and so layered. And it was just mind-boggling to me that at the core of Agatha Christie's life was an actual mystery, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you, in your own words, kind of tell us what that main plot point is and the mystery is in this book?
Yeah. So Well, the mystery itself happened on, I think, in the wee hours of the morning, December 3rd, the evening of December 3rd into the wee hours of the morning of December 4th, 1926. Agatha was a relatively young woman. She was in her mid 30s. And just to back up a second, she had been like kind of raised in this wonderful, idyllic seaside turn of the century life. She married, or seemingly idyllic, she married a World War I pilot. And she and her husband and their young daughter, Rosalind, lived in this really beautiful house, which they had named Styles, which, if you're familiar with Agatha Christie's work, her very first book, which we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year, was called The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And when they bought their house, they renamed it Styles in honor of her first book. So in the hours leading up to her disappearance, she just went missing. And in the early hours of the morning of December 4th, her car was found running. She had a Morris Cowley. It was found running on the edge of a cliff that or a very steep hill that overlooked a very deep, still lake referred to as the Silent Pool. It was really the stuff of legend in their area. Her car, like I said, was running. The lights were on when it was originally found. It was empty. She was nowhere to be found. And her belongings were all strewn about the area, including a heavy fur coat, which would have been really helpful because it was like an extremely cold evening for England. And no one knew where she was. And that's really the very first day of her disappearance. As the 11 days of her disappearance unfold, and this is something I really delved into the research in because there's a lot of it, it led to her disappearance and sort of the press coverage about this young mother, wife of a World War I hero, who was a mystery novelist on the rise, going missing, captured the attention of the media and the press, and thousands of people started to volunteer to try and find her. As the days progressed and there was no sight or sign of her, except these very empty promises of sightings in the countryside that they tracked down, more and more people started to volunteer. And at the end, it was the largest manhunt in England's history. People were combing the acres and acres around the area where her car was found. They dredged the lake near where her car was found. And they set off all these different police forces trying to find her and following up on all the reports. And then on the 11th day, she, just as mysteriously as she had disappeared, she reappeared with no explanation for her disappearance. She claimed amnesia. And I think I mentioned the press really kind of went wild with this story. She really captivated not just the people of England, but the people of America, Europe. I mean, you can find newspaper articles all over the globe. In the days leading up to her disappearance, as the press started to cover this event, it became clear that she and her husband were having some difficulties. And he became very much the focus of the investigation, among other things. So as the days went on, more and more people were involved. The speculation grew. It was this massive.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I was thoroughly enjoying that. And then she went away. So I'm sure she'll be back with us.
Sorry. I was right at the big event. Anyway, and then she disappeared, and she reappeared just as suddenly as she disappeared. And that is really the real life event that forms the core of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great. You know, it's funny, as a reader, I already knew about Christie's biography. I knew she was married to Archie, war pilot, huge romance, etc., and that things turned bad later. That's not necessarily a spoiler. She remarried, etc. So the book is divided into two parts. There's a courtship of her and Archie early on, and I will say, as I was reading, I kept going, spoiler alert, he's not a good guy. But it was so nice to actually see her as a young woman falling in love and mother and then dealing with marriage and trying, there's one scene you wrote where she watches him chew chicken and he starts chewing the chicken slower than she'd like, and she realizes that she hasn't cooked the chicken well again, and she feels like a failure as a wife and a mother. And history remembers her clearly as an amazing writer, best-selling author of all time, but those day-to-day vignettes were I will say actually almost at times hard to read, because I was thinking, God, Agatha Christie, if you just knew you don't have to be the perfect wife, like you're Agatha Christie. Was it hard to write that? And obviously you intended to extremely humanize her. So.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so funny you say that. We think about, when we think of Agatha Christie, at least I think of her as she became, this legendary figure, the sort of silver-haired English matron who concocted the most dastardly unsolvable puzzles, right? These incredible books. But I really realized as I started to look into her life, I really knew nothing about her, and certainly nothing about her as a young woman, like you said, a young mother, but also somebody growing up in a time period when, the societal message that she's receiving is that is really all that's important. Growing up, she grew up in the pre-World War I time period. Her job, as she was told, was to marry well. She was from a moneyed background, not aristocratic, but that was really her job. And her mother's message to her was that your husband should absolutely come first. And so she was really, as time went on, and initially she started writing because her sister Madge had kind of challenged her to write an unsolvable mystery, and she was going to prove her sister that she could indeed do it. They were very competitive. At the beginning, she really pursued writing because they needed the money. Archie really struggled coming back from World War I. I think he probably had some form of PTSD, but things like that weren't talked about during that time period. But, she's kind of caught. And then as time goes on, she realizes how much she actually loves writing for its own sake. And she's caught in the crosshairs of the societal message about what's important, the message that ambition is really a dirty word for women, and what her actual feelings are, the really authentic life she wants to lead. And kind of writing that, as I kind of delved into her life and I saw this juncture that she was in, which was really a function of her time period, I realized it was a really actually very timely issue still for women, that balance between career and family. And ambition's not a dirty word now, but it's something that women struggle with. So seeing her like that, it was kind of hard sometimes to make sense of the woman that she was and the woman that she became. But it was also so much fun to see the person that she was before the disappearance as well. Not the person who was really struggling kind of in the years and months leading up to her disappearance, but the young, adventuresome woman, this crazy person. She grew up, in this sort of time period when women were like delicate flowers, and the women of her class in particular were. But she volunteered as a nurse. She didn't know what she was doing during World War I. All of her peers were fainting at the sight of blood. And here she was, like, fascinated watching surgeries on wounded soldiers. And then she went over and got all the special pharmacist training, became an expert in medicines and poisons, which of course served her very well later, as a lot of her plots kind of revolve poisons. So they were things that were really not in keeping with the person she was told she should be. She had a really adventuresome spirit and a really gregarious nature that societal message it wanted to make her small and put her in this box. And she was so much bigger than that. She really was. So yeah, to answer your question, it was hard sometimes to write her that way and see her in these painful situations. But they also, I think, were important because they made her into the person that she became to become the legendary Agatha Christie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And not giving anything away, there is a moment when she realizes, maybe I'm not just a downtrodden wife, you know. So
Right.
that's a good moment. But
Yeah.
there are times when I, you know, wanted to talk to the book and be like, come on,
Right.
don't deal with this. So I
Well,
mean,
you know, it's hard in two respects. First, you know, we have, of course, the benefit of hindsight, right? We know she's going to turn into something magnificent. But also, it's hard from our more modern day perspective sometimes to look at historic women, see the situations that they find themselves in, and we want to shake them and say, why are you tolerating this? Or what are you waiting for? Why are you putting up with this? But the reality was their options were much more limited. Now, Agatha, you know, came from a higher class where divorce was by no means common or acceptable, but it was possible. But for women of lower means, that wasn't even a possibility. She had more choices, but even still, they were very limited in the impact that they were going to have on her.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting talking about how her sister's match was good for some reasons, and then Agatha maybe had different standards for her matches, and obviously that's all you know, history when I'm looking at being a modern American woman in my 30s now, you know, but
Right.
you know, and I completely respect that. I'm just saying that there were moments when I was like, oh, you're Agatha Christie.
I know.
You know? So
if you only could see what you're going to become, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you just want to tell her how magnificent she really is.
Yes. Speaking of fun things and her being gregarious, you put in one of my favorite little tidbits about her when she went surfing.
I know. Don't you love that?
Yes, yes. I love that. So I have a question. Aside from surfing, what was the most interesting tidbit that you found in your research about her?
Oh, wow. The surfing is usually the one that I find not just because it's so hard to imagine, number one, a young Agatha Christie, and then imagine her on a surfboard. And I've seen the picture, so I know it's real. Yeah. Sometimes it's really shocking, especially. I just lost you. Oh, you're back.
You're back. You're back. We're good.
So they think that she was actually like the record holder for that she was the very first one. So that's so cool unto itself. I mean, I think for me, it was given, you know, when I learned that she had become so involved as a nurse and as a pharmacist during World War I was really deep in the research about her life and what it was like. You know, she grew up in this very cosseted, she was the youngest child by quite a lot. Her mother never really believed that children should not learn to read until they were like 5 or 6. Agatha was a self-taught reader. You know, she obviously defied her mother's desires there. And she led this very idyllic, it's hard to almost describe it and to think about it from her perspective, this cosseted seaside, beautiful existence. And that's really how she describes it. It's how she remembers it. It's a way of life that was about to disappear. You know, during World War I, in between World War I and World War II, this kind of life just didn't happen anymore, not really. And so when I learned that amidst all this kind of comfort and that she rose up and chose to become a nurse and a pharmacist herself. I mean, yes, people were helping out in the war effort, but not all women were. And a lot of women were choosing to do things in the home front, if at all. So the fact that she would rise up and choose that was really surprising to me. And just her tenacity in pursuing writing, especially in the sort of crime mystery field, which was very heavily dominated by men. It just required a certain amount of unusual, not just intellect and skill, but determination, tenacity, pluck. I mean, all of that really surprised me because when I think about Agatha, I think about the woman on the other side of this disappearance, the woman who's already established, not just with her 5th novel. You know, this is a woman. So I think all of those things really surprised me. And one other thing, which isn't really a positive, it just is very telling about how conflicted she was at this time. She and her husband, Archie, went on a year-round tour. They left for a year as part of his work, promoting this big exhibition that was going to happen in London. They went on a round the world tour of all I mean, really almost any continent that was affiliated with Great Britain. It was part of his job. There were a whole bunch of them that went, and the wives were invited to come. But of course, she couldn't bring her 1-year-old child. So she left her child behind with her mother for a year. She didn't see her. And, that really surprised me. I can't imagine, I'm a mom. I can't imagine leaving my kids behind for that long. And she was conflicted too, but she was also conflicted about being a mom. That was something that, she knew she was supposed to do. She loved her daughter, absolutely. But she was so desirous of this adventure that she was able to do that. And I think that was also very, very telling about really who she was at her core and what was important to her. So I think I didn't answer your question by saying one thing. I gave you like 4 different things, but I found her to be a really surprising, astonishing, incredible woman for her time.
Yeah, absolutely. Very forward thinking. And, I listened to this podcast called All About Agatha, where they dissect, very detailed dissection of each one of her books in chronological order. And they've covered the disappearance also. But one of the things they grade the books, like how it holds up in modern times, or how well drawn the characters are, or the plot in of itself. And so they have this whole grading system, and then they have a total and they rank the books, and it's a lot of fun, and it's they go through the plot. It's great. Yeah, it's called All About Agatha. Anyway, they do the basic plot at the beginning and like a 2-minute rundown. So, spoilers if you haven't read the book.
Yeah.
But then they go about all of her methods of writing and what she's done and what the strengths and weaknesses of the books are. And one of the things that they're critical of her to a certain extent, while still obviously they love her enough to have a podcast about her,
right, exactly.
is that one of the criteria is that they grade on fairness to the reader. And if she's ever going to be unfair, it's in poisons. And that's because the tiny scientific elements or poisons that she might have come across in that job that she had are not necessarily broad knowledge to all readers. And so almost any time there's some very specific, like scientific or poison related element in the book, they always grade her down because it's not necessarily fair to the reader. Yeah.
Oh, but it's funny.
It's because of her own personal experience working with that. So, you kind of get to see how that shaped her writing later on. It's fascinating to me. I
listen to that. I'm not familiar with it, especially because one of the things I did as part of my research was, and I did focus more on the earlier books, but I kind of did a timeline of her life as I was kind of parsing through her upbringing, her early years as a young woman, as a young married woman. And then when she started writing, I would map out the books, reread the books and map them out as I did the research. Because very often I feel like writers, whether they do it unconsciously or consciously, there's little bits and pieces of themselves in the book, whether it's the topic they choose, something about the characterization. So I'm looking for things about her, and so as I was reading them, I was definitely rereading them sometimes for great pleasure at times, but sometimes, I am coming across one like The Man in the Brown Suit, which is one of her earliest ones. Most people have never heard of it. And it's more like a heist book than a mystery. It's kind of crazy. And you can see how she's evolving as a writer and what's ringing true and what's not ringing true. And I like them for different reasons than probably the people at All About Agatha do. Like that book, The Man in the Brown Suit, is a sentimental favorite of mine because she wrote that right after she went on that round the world tour. And it's this very youthful, hopeful, optimistic Agatha, who's not only the main character in the book, but that's really who she was at that time. And she's incorporating all these stuff about her travels and observations that she made. So, and then as the years go on, there's a certain, I don't want to say formulaic, but she becomes a little bit more formulaic. And sometimes her characters aren't as richly drawn. And you get to see a little bit that she's on a deadline as opposed to really just excited about what she's writing. So I've got to listen to that. That's fascinating. It
Well,
really
and
is.
they provide context with, like, they do the books in chronological order, and sometimes they do short stories in between or whatever to kind of give a break. You can tell also when these podcasters need a little more time, but they have shorter short story episodes, but they provide real life context. So like the Man in the Brown Suit episode, they talk about the Commonwealth tour, and they also talk about, it's funny, if you listen to like 20 of them, you find out that Agatha, like, the handsome man is always tan and blue eyed. Like, you can tell she has a type. Like,
Oh,
or
100%.
if there's an actor in the book, they're up to no good. They might not be the villain, but they're going to be worthless. Like, you could tell she had an opinion about actors. So
Oh, that's awesome.
they find all these patterns in them. I've enjoyed the podcast thoroughly just because of that.
Because
fun.
Obviously ends, but it kind of ends around 1926. When all the storylines kind of come together. And of course, I've read many of her books after that, but I didn't analyze them with the same kind of attention to detail and with the same purpose that I did with those early. Was The Murder of Roger Akroyd, which is one of her most famous books even now, I think, and it's like the quintessential unreliable narrator book. And of course, that structure heavily influenced my structure and the themes that I was thinking about in the book. And so it was just a very different writing experience in a way, because, I'm a writer writing about a historic writer, studying her mysteries at the same time that I'm writing it. So it was a very unusual, but really fascinating process. But I wish I'd known all about Agatha, or maybe not. Sometimes I have to be careful hearing other people's perspectives as I'm writing about a character.
Yeah, no, I am in no way insinuating you should have listened to it. But now, if you want more information or a different angle, or you want to listen to the later ones, it's really fascinating because they do put it in context of what's going on with her life, and it's pretty cool. Okay, I want to get back to you and your book, though. So, have you ever visited the places in your book in real life?
Yeah, most of them. I mean, I have to say, since the pandemic, I haven't gotten to do a lot of what I would hope to do. But in terms of Agatha, I've gone to a lot of the places, there's blue plaques, a lot of the places where she lived throughout England, throughout London. The place, of course, that's most famous is the place that she lived in after the fact. Green, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but it's her famous manor house. Mm-hmm. But I've been to Devon. Her house isn't there anymore, but to get a sense of what the landscape looks like, you can get a sense of kind of where her house was. And that is always, the tricky thing about writing about historic places and events and people, is you can go to the place and you can get a general sense of it, but of course the place never looks the same as it did at that time. And so you can only really conjure up so much from the environment when you go back to visit it. But yes, I have been to many, many of the places that she went, and tried to, use a magic wand and try and figure out what it was like at the time. Fortunately, Agatha is so popular, of course, there's lots of photographs from the time period. There's a lot of records and stuff that you can go back to kind of reconstruct, places and aspects that are gone now. But yeah, you can still get a really good sense of it. I mean, there's Agatha Christie, I think, tours of England that you can take. So that I haven't done, but I've seen quite a lot.
That's fun. So I do want to mention that we're 33 minutes in, so it's a little late for me to mention this. But if you missed the beginning of this, you can always wait for our live to be over, both here on Facebook and on YouTube, and watch this from the beginning. I know I have enjoyed the conversation so far. Also, pop in some questions and comments. I'm going to get to the comments, get to the questions very shortly. Let's see. So, more about Christie.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like her popularity never wanes. And in fact, in this pandemic, we have sold more Christie books than anything else in the store.
Seriously?
I have, hundreds. It's incredible. Yeah. So I know people, well, I'm not going to give my theory yet, but I was wondering if you have a theory on her constant popularity, why she has lasted when so many others haven't.
Oh, I definitely have a theory. I mean, some of it's probably heightened in the pandemic, but I think there's a couple things. I mean, first of all, I do think there's something, I think people are very attracted puzzling nature at the core of her books. And I think they're not unsolvable, but they are very, very tricky to make out. And it does take, a certain amount of brain power, intellect, tenacity to kind of get at them. But like you said before, she actually belonged to this organization called the Detection Club. I don't know if you know it. It's fascinating. It's a group of this kind of a tangent, but it's a group of, she was one of the early members, a golden age of mystery novelists. And they had this crazy ceremony. Are you familiar with this? Where they would...
Not the ceremony.
Okay. So you had to be invited. You had to be worthy of the, of...
I think maybe we lost Marie. Oh, you're back. Okay. You're back. So you had to be worthy. That's where we lost you. Yeah.
And they would have this like very elaborate swearing in induction ceremony where you had to say this special, there were all these candles and this great procession, and whoever was in charge of it, you had to make this special vow over a skull, right? So it's very dramatic, of course, not a surprise. But in part of the vow was that you would and they used all these great old English terms that are, anachronistic now, but basically that you'd use no trickery in your book, that you wouldn't use like an act of God or some such like sleight of hand nonsense, that it had to be a real, true puzzle that the reader and the detective had to legitimately solve. And I think that's a big attraction in some ways of her novels still, is that for the most part, probably all about Agatha would have different thoughts on key puzzles, and not everyone can figure them out. And sometimes once you figured them out at the end, or once you've been told the answer, you want to go back and reread it and figure it out for yourself, right? So I think that's the intellectual part of it. But I think there's something more, and I think it's very much the case. Maybe it would explain why her books are selling like hotcakes right now. But she presents, I think, these really picture-perfect, idyllic worlds that have become disordered, usually through a murder. Although, of course, there's a couple instances in which there's been heists, like the Diamond Heist and some other ones. But for the most part, there's a disorder, a rift kind of in this world. And her detectives, Poirot, Miss Marple, Tommy and Tuppence, and there's some other ones, come in and they solve it. And at the end, all is right again in the world. And I think there's something very soothing. It's kind of weird to use that word with respect to an Agatha Christie novel, but something very satisfying about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 1,000% my opinion on it as well. Like people, if things, I have seen this for working at the store for many years now. If things seem uncertain, or right after we've had a horrible hurricane here in Houston and everyone's worried, and they need some kind of escape, they need some kind of balance and order back in their lives in a place where in real life they can't get it. So they turn to those books where there's not going to be some noir ending at the end that's going to leave things unsettled. They reach out for resolution, and her books absolutely have that, and justice also. If something seems wrong in the world, there's always an element of justice. So that to me is, 1,000% why people are just coming in droves for Agatha Christie books right now, because there's nothing in our control. Like we cannot restore order ourselves, right? So,
in any aspect. I mean,
none of it. Yeah.
The locust plagues have come and all is over. There's something else. Yeah. I think the way you said it is so wise. It's it's not just the restoration of order to a disordered world. It's also that justice is served in the end. I don't think there's any book in which there's some sort of unsettled, untied up element. And that, I think that's something that we need right now. We need a world which we can lose ourselves. And her books are they really are engrossing, right? So you can kind of check out from this world, dip into a different one, and know that everything's going to be all right in the end. And the ride might be tough. You might have some twists and turns along the way, but all is going to be right in the world. And I imagine, although I don't know, you would know this from working in the store, that books akin to that are also very popular right now. I see like the Thursday Murder Club, which is newer, is very popular right now, which is, I think, in many ways very Agatha Christie-esque.
Absolutely.
You have a disordered world, and not only is it going to be restored, but 4, septuagenarians are going to restore it. So if they can do it, we can make it work here. But yeah, I do think there's a sense of that, and maybe that's why she has had this resurgence popularity. But I feel like this year there's a lot of anniversaries. It's the 100th anniversary of the publication of her first book, but there's also something more that's making people kind of crave her, I feel like.
Oh, absolutely. And as you were saying earlier, there's that pact with the reader that you might not get the solution, but you're never going to feel cheated, because everything is in there. Like, you may have missed it. It may have been very, very cleverly buried, or there have been 3 other red herrings that you followed, but that pact with the reader is fair play always. So
that's exactly right.
There's that too. And of course there's a sure thing, if people are going to commit to time and money and all the things about getting books to read during this, there is a sure thing with an Agatha Christie book. You know what you're going to get. So
that's exactly right. You do. It might look a little different. You might have a different hero at the core, but and it's not formulaic in that way, but it is very predictable in that sense. You know what you're going to get, and the world is steady under your feet.
Yes, absolutely. So we have 2 questions that are essentially the same question. So I'm going to pop up Lindsay's, but Anita, this is your question as well. So Lindsay's a lawyer, and she's just curious how you balance your time as a lawyer and writing books.
Well, Lindsay, I have not practiced as a lawyer. I've actually been writing books litigator in New York City for over a decade. I never started out thinking I was going to be a writer. I was just really a lover of history, and I was a crazy reader. And when I got my first idea for a novel, and the impetus to write, I was probably my second or third year as a lawyer. And so that first book took me 8 years to write. I wrote it in fits and starts. I worked crazy hours as a lawyer. I didn't know what I was doing. And so it took me a long time to write that first book, but I've been so lucky that ever since I've published a book almost every single year. And so since that happened, I've been very happy to hang up my shingle or put away my shingle, whatever the right phrase is, and focus exclusively on writing. Sometimes I would definitely say the skills I learned as a lawyer really come in handy. As a lawyer, especially as a litigator, with working on really complex, mostly commercial and on securities litigation. But what I found was that what I liked about the job was that I loved diving deep into the facts and the law and assembling a narrative that I would advocate on behalf of my client. That was the part that I liked. But it was the subject matter I didn't feel passionate about. And that skill set is what I do every day. Right now, instead of diving into legal facts and the case law, I'm, knee deep in historical research, but I'm still crafting a narrative on behalf of a client, advocating for them. It's just not a traditional client, right? It's a historical woman that I really feel like I'm advocating for their kind of right to hold a big place in history. And so I use all those skills every day, but I'm very happy to be doing that on behalf of a historical woman and not a paying client. Thanks. So I'm sorry I don't have like a magic. I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing right now.
And I'm going to take this moment to ask you who that woman is right now that you're diving into historically.
Ooh, well, I have to say the pandemic has been hard, but it has been very prolific for me. I just finished up the book that comes out next January, and I have another book coming out in June, a co-written book. So I have in June, I have a book coming out called The Personal Librarian, my first co-written novel with the wonderful writer Victoria Christopher Murray. It's about J.P. Morgan, who we all know, famous financier, beginning of the 20th century. He built this institution in New York City called the Morgan Library, which holds his magnificent, priceless collection of ancient manuscripts. And he hired a woman to run it. Her name was Belle DaCosta Green. The only way she was able to hold the place in society that she did in her role at the library was by hiding her true identity. She was actually African American, but she was fair enough to pass as white. And she had to suppress the legacy that her father had left her. Her father was the first African American graduate from Harvard, and he was an advocate for equality alongside like Booker T. Washington, some people that we know a lot more than him. But the world that she was living in was one of segregation, and she wouldn't have even been allowed in the Morgan Library, let alone to run it. So, it's this, look at this incredible life. This woman became like the most powerful person in the art world for decades, but also this really deep dive into this crazy period of time in our country's history. And then I have a book coming out next January, I think. It's about Rosalind Franklin. It's a really suspenseful, not going to sound suspenseful, but it's really suspenseful. It's about, she was a scientist in the 1940s and 50s, and through unbelievable labors on her part, she discovered the double helix structure and nature of DNA. And then there's this massive suspense and betrayal in her life when one of her colleagues, Morris Wilkins, took her research and shared it with two men that we do know the name of, Francis Crick and James Watson, who took it and in almost like a 10-day period wrote a paper using her research. And then they won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA. So it's the story of a woman whose legacy is absolutely unbelievable. Obviously very timely issues, but oh my gosh, I had no idea that science could be so suspenseful. What happened around her discovery and the theft and what happened afterwards? It's mind-blowing. It really is. So I just finished that one, and I'm just about to embark on the one that'll come out in January of 2023.
So you said earlier you had been lucky enough to publish a book a year, but I also think you've been hardworking enough to publish a book a year, because it sounds like you have been very hard at work. I will say that Morgan Library is one of my favorite places on earth. And
knowing it, most people haven't been there, and it is like unbelievable.
It's incredible. But also, shame on that building for not having huge notice about this person, because I have never heard this story. So, yeah. Yes, I'm very excited about you telling it. And if you ever have a chance, if you're watching and you haven't been to the Morgan Library in New York, it is incredible. I highly, highly, highly recommend it.
And I have to say that during, it's been kind of closed and open throughout the pandemic. They took the really unusual step of making a lot of their programs and tours of the library available online right now. And I would highly recommend it, because I have to say, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, I think. I really do. It is just exquisite. And the nature of their collection, if you love books, it's breathtaking. And she was really the force behind that collection. And she built it. And then she's the one who made sure that it stopped being a private library for the Morgan family and became a public institution. She made that happen. And so made all that enormous collection available to scholars and public alike. So she's a really important person that nobody's ever heard of. And, you're right about them not shining a light on her work. I only found out about her. I used to go there when I was hiding out from my work as a lawyer when I lived in New York City. I didn't like being a lawyer and I wanted to be something else. A docent mentioned her to me when I was there one day. And so she was on my list maybe before almost anybody else. And she didn't mention that she was African American, but I was fascinated by the fact that it was a woman and she was really nowhere to be found. And even as recently as 2 years ago, her role was starting to come out into the light, but not highlighted probably in the way that it should be. And the Morgan has really taken ownership of that in the past year. And they're really committed to doing more about that. I mean, it's such a fascinating, important story that the role that she shaping art collections, art taste, and building up that library into what it is today. It's really a museum more than anything else. But.
Yeah, and if you know the Morgan Library, then you understand like the substance of which you're speaking. Like, I mean, it's an incredible collection.
It's middle class. I mean, it has a collection of things in it that I mean, you're talking about like the Louvre, it's amazing.
The classical music manuscripts there are I found to be better than the British Library, and I seek them out, and so I mean it's really like it's at least what the British Library had on display when I was there, but it's really monumental, that collection, and that's an amazing story. I can't wait to read that. That's great.
It's wonderful what she did. I mean, JP Morgan was kind of a dilettante collector. I'll take a snuff box of Napoleon over here and a Gutenberg Bible over there. But in terms of like an actual cohesive, important collection, that was all her.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so we do have a couple more Christie questions. I was going to ask you earlier about your favorite Christie and the one that you recommend to readers most who haven't read Christie, but let's roll that in to this question from Fariha. Do you have a favorite between Hercule Poirot and Jane Marple? Also, highly recommend the podcast all about Agatha. Yay! Their episodes are great. So, Poirot, Marple, and then maybe some of your favorites.
Well, I definitely have. I have to say, I'm glad you categorized it because I find that people do ask me, do I have a favorite Christie? And I could never pick just one. They're similar but very distinct. And so I probably have like a favorite Marple, favorite Poirot, favorite different categories. I would say my favorite Miss Marple is probably A Murder Announced. I don't know if you know that one, but that's when the townspeople get an invitation to a murder and they assume it's like a murder mystery party, but it's not. I just love that one. I love the structure of the story. I love the way that Miss Marple's character comes out in that particular one. I love her. And I think in some ways, I think that she is kind of like how Agatha herself became later in her life. She was started out as this like gregarious woman. And after this incident with the disappearance, she really changed. She became very private, very reserved, even with her family. But she was ever watchful, ever scrutinizing, always a little bit involved, she wasn't exactly Miss Marple, but there were some elements of her there. And I think in that one in particular, I see Agatha. My two favorite Poirots, and also probably the two books that I would recommend to people who want to read a Christie but have never read a Christie, are the classics, Death on the Nile and A Murder on the Orient Express. I wish I would pick something else, but I love those two. I mean, they're so masterful. I mean, for me, both of them have these really unique, iconic settings. Murder on the Orient Express, of course, has that, I think, the best puzzle in it and the most satisfying solution to the murder. I think it's genius. And that's my probably particular favorite. Death on the Nile, I was a history major. I thought maybe I'd be an Egyptologist. So like Death on the Nile has like a special little place in my heart for the setting. Unreliable narrator, absolutely. Murder of Roger Akroyd. I talked about that earlier. It's the book that came out right before her disappearance. I think for me, that book is very telling of her mindset. And actually, when I reread that as part of my research, it was the book that really sealed, without giving too much away, about kind of my solution about what happened during the vanishing. That was the book that really, for me, made crystal clear what my version would be. To me, after I read that, I just thought, it's masterful. How could a woman this brilliant in the art of plotting, so crafty in the way she creates masks and facades for her characters, how could she be a victim in her own vanishing? Like, how could that have happened? And it planted or reaffirmed that seed that was there about the kind of role she may or may not have had in her disappearance, right? So that book is a particular favorite book just because it's a book you're going to want to read and then reread at the end, right? That's one of the ones I know I always kind of go back to see how she did it from like a craft perspective. But I think that one was really critical to me personally for the outcome of this book. I'm going to put it in the category of a sentimental favorite, and that's The Man in the Brown Suit. I mentioned it earlier. It's really, it's not the best written. There are times when I'm like, oh really? Are you serious? But there's something in it that's just so so young Agatha, so youthful Agatha, so exuberant. And in that way, it's kind of, I just have a soft spot for it for that reason. And there's one I'm just going to throw out there because something else happened with the particular story. And most people have not heard of this one. It's a Tommy and Tuppence. I don't know if you're familiar. Most people don't know Tommy and Tuppence. They're a duo. They're like a spy duo. She wrote a couple books about Tommy and Tuppence as heroes. In one book, they're very young. And in this particular book, N or M with a question mark, they're actually in their later years. And it's World War II, and they want to find a way to help out during the war. And they've been marginalized because of their age. And Agatha wrote this during World War II when she was feeling marginalized because of her age. She was acting as a pharmacist as her way to help out. Her second husband had volunteered. His facility with languages was really helpful, and she was feeling very frustrated. And this book, actually, it's a great spy thriller, more than a murder mystery. But it came to the attention of MI5 because she has mentioned.
Okay, she'll be back. I too want to know what has been mentioned in M because it's one of them that I have not read. So.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
In it, she mentions ...
Oh yes. So this book came to the attention of MI5 because she referenced one of her main characters had the name Bletchley. And we know now, of course, that Bletchley Park was the highly secret code-breaking center during World War II in England. The authorities were like beside themselves, thinking that maybe she knew something that she shouldn't, and she was telecasting it. And she actually happened to be very good friends with one of the senior codebreakers there. His name was Dilly Knox. He was actually like an Egyptologist or something at Cambridge or Oxford. And I kind of came to all this because Kate Quinn, do you know the writer Kate Quinn? She's the new book coming out, Rose Code, which is terrific. She came across this in her research. She's like, we were doing an event together, and she's like, oh my God, I'm reading about Agatha Christie right now. And so it's just really fun. It was, for me, it was, just really fun to explore that. But it was also a really interesting look at Agatha on the other side, what she was like after the disappearance, how she changed and how she didn't. And what this book and the circumstances around it and her history during this time period really show at her core who she still really was, even though she wasn't this gregarious, outgoing, adventuresome person anymore after the disappearance. She was still crafty and, wily and had her hand in everything. So it's a favorite for other reasons. So I recommend it.
I was when we lost you, I was telling the audience that I actually haven't read that one, so I'm gonna get to it shortly. That sounds fantastic.
It's really good. It's different. There was actually an adaptation. I think the BBC did it not that long ago. Don't watch it.
Okay, fair enough. That's okay. Sometimes they're amazing and sometimes they're not. So
right.
So Daniel was wondering, you've already asked the first half of his question, but he was wondering, did Agatha base any of her characters on her first husband, either before or after?
I think, she also wrote this series of books under the name Mary Westmacott. You probably know that, McKenna. I think there are hints of him in the Mary. Those are not mysteries. I don't want to call them romance novels. They're kind of like romance. They're kind of different. There's hints of him in there. I actually think he's one of the characters in The Man in the Brown Suit. I do. I think aspects of who he is or who she hoped he would be are in the main character, in the love interest in that book.
Yeah.
I don't know that he appears as a character except in little snippets, observations elsewhere, but I do think that what she went through, her suspicions, her sense of being betrayed, those experiences, those you see over and over again in her books. Yeah. The fear of that, going through that sort of breach of her trust, the betrayal, and then, all eyes on her. I think you see that again and again in the book, in a lot of her books. But she was canny enough. He was father for only child. I think, they maintained a relationship down the road, and I think she wanted to be careful of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the last question we'll have from the audience before wrapping up is from Shanti. She was wondering, just curious as to whether any of the books appeared as serials. And then a follow-up to that, any insights into how this might have influenced the structure of the classical mystery novel as we know it today? Great question.
I love that question. Yeah. I definitely... Well, here's the thing. Agatha wrote a lot of serials, especially in the early days. It was a good way to make money when she was starting out. There was a bunch of Hercule Poirots that she, in the early days, that she wrote as serials, and sometimes just as short stories that she kind of stitched together later that were made into books. And then there's a couple of instances in which other people other than Agatha stitched them together as books later. But I think that's a great question. And I personally love serials. I think there's something very captivating about it to kind of lure us in step by step. And I think the way in which audiobooks are popular now is something that we may want to rethink when we think about story writing. I think I wouldn't say I would necessarily write a serial, but I think in the way that I wrote this book, it's not, I wasn't trying to write a serial, but there's something serial-esque about it because the first 2/3 of the book are really two distinct storylines. One is the story of, it's really a lot like my other novels. It's a deep dive into Agatha as a person. It's almost like her origin story, almost like a superhero origin story. And then interwoven in that are an account of the 11 days told from the perspective of her husband. And riddled throughout those two storylines and structures is the question of who you can trust in those storylines. And then the third, the stories coalesce. They come together, still in Agatha's voice, but there's a lot of questions. Hopefully a satisfying end. I don't know if the world's so up with a bow as tied up with a bow like Agatha did. But as I'm writing the book, I can almost hear it broken out into sections in my head, almost like might do a serial radio play back in the day, or a serial, as they used to in magazines do, or newspapers even. serial stories. And I do think there's something really interesting about them that we might want to be revisiting today.
Yeah, great answer. I know it's not as common for things to be serialized anymore, but Laura Lippman did a thing. I don't know if it was in New York Magazine or what it was years ago. The Girl in the Green Raincoat, and she took her series character, and it's essentially a novella that was serialized. But the main character is pregnant and bedridden, so a little different than normal. And she sees this girl on her walks every day. And then the girl goes missing, and she decides to solve the mystery from bed, a la Josephine Tey's Daughter of Time. I wish I had read it serialized. I didn't. I read it as the novella, but that's it doesn't happen very often that things are serialized. But I think it's a great format because inherently you have to leave the reader wanting more, right? Each installment. Right. So. And we did have some comments earlier on about people who have listened to this one on audio already and enjoyed it. So sounds like you're hearing the sections and keeping it going well translated.
A lot, because I do hear it in my own head. And when you have the end of a chapter, I can hear it when it has that right pause, like you were saying at the end of a serial, whether it's audio or written. There's a moment when you want to leave people hanging in a particular way, and you can almost sense it when it's there. So I take that as a call. Thank you. I appreciate that. You never know how that's going to come out.
Yeah. There are also lots of other complimentary things. People who've read the book or can't wait to read it. I will say that if you enjoyed this interview today, and for those of you who have and have said that, thank you so much. We do have copies of The Mystery of Mrs. Christie available at Murder by the Book. We would love nothing more than for you to order a copy from us if you haven't already purchased it elsewhere. And we have tons of other great recommendations on our website and elsewhere. Lots of fun things on YouTube. So if you are enjoying these and feel a desire to support us, we would certainly appreciate it. Marie, it has been a pleasure talking to you tonight.
It has been a pleasure. Can I just say one quick shout out how important it is to support our independent bookstores? I mean, you guys you have pivoted on a dime and have created a whole new world for us to connect with. And, indie bookstores are so much of the hub of our communities, whether they're virtual and in person. So I'm back. And thank you so much for having me, McKenna. It has been just a delight talking to you tonight. And thank you to those of you who decided to tune in and listen to us.
All right. It's been a pleasure on my end too. And thanks for bearing with the tiny technical difficulties we had. We made it through, Marie. We made it through. So I'm going to hang up. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.